Section 3 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. A digression concerning critics. Though I have been hitherto as cautious as I could, upon all occasions, most nicely to follow the rules and methods of writing laid down by the example of our illustrious moderns, yet has the unhappy shortness of my memory led me into an error from which I must immediately extricate myself, before I can decently pursue my principal subject. I confess with shame it was an unpardonable omission to proceed so far as I have already done, before I had performed the due discourses, expostulatory, supplicatory, or deprecatory, with my good lords the critics. Towards some atonement for this grievous neglect, I do here make humbly bold to present them with a short account of themselves and their art, by looking into the original and pedigree of the word, as it is generally understood among us, and very briefly considering the ancient and present state thereof. By the word critic, at this day so frequent in all conversations, there have sometimes been distinguished three very different species of mortal men, according as I have read in ancient books and pamphlets. For first, by this term were understood such persons as invented or drew up rules for themselves and the world, by observing which a careful reader might be able to pronounce upon the productions of the learned, form his taste to a true relish of the sublime and the admirable, and divide every beauty of matter or of style from the corruption that apes it. In our common perusal of books, singling out the errors and defects, the nauseous, the fulsome, the dull, and the impertinent, with the caution of a man that walks through Edinburgh streets in a morning, who is indeed as careful as he can to watch diligently and spy out the filth in his way, not that he is curious to observe the colour and complexion of the ordure, or take its dimensions, much less to be paddling in or tasting it, but only with a design to come out as cleanly as he may. These men seem, though very erroneously, to have understood the appellation of critic in a literal sense, that one principal part of his office was to praise and acquit, and that a critic who sets up to read only for an occasion of censure and reproof is a creature as barbarous as a judge who should take up a resolution to hang all men that came before him upon a trial. Again, by the word critic have been meant the restorers of ancient learning from the worms and graves and dust of manuscripts. Now the races of these two have been for some ages utterly extinct, and besides, to discourse any further of them would not be at all to my purpose. The third and noblest sort is that of the true critic, whose original is the most ancient of all. Every true critic is a hero born, descending in a direct line from a celestial stem, by Momus and Hybris, who begat Zoilus, who begat Tigellius, who begat etc. the elder, who begat Bentley, and Rymer, and Wotton, and Perrault, and Dennis, who begat etc. the younger. And these are the critics from whom the commonwealth of learning has in all ages received such immense benefits, that the gratitude of their admirers placed their origin in heaven, among those of Hercules, Theseus, Perseus, and other great deservers of mankind. But heroic virtue itself have not been exempt from the obloquy of evil tongues. For it hath been objected that those ancient heroes, famous for their combating so many giants and dragons and robbers, were in their own persons a great nuisance to mankind, and any of those monsters they subdued, and therefore, to render their obligations more complete, when all other vermin were destroyed, should in conscience have concluded with the same justice upon themselves as Hercules most generously did, and hath upon that score procured for himself more temples and votaries than the best of his fellows. For these reasons, I suppose it is why some have conceived it would be very expedient for the public good of learning that every true critic, as soon as he had finished his task assigned, should immediately deliver himself up to ratsbane or hemp, or from some convenient altitude, and that no man's pretensions to so illustrious a character should by any means be received before that operation was performed. Now, from this heavenly descent of criticism and the close analogy it bears to heroic virtue, it is easy to assign the proper employment of a true, ancient, genuine critic which is to travel through this vast world of writings, to peruse and hunt those monstrous faults bred within them, to drag out the lurking errors, like Cacus from his den, to multiply them like Hydra's heads, to rake them together like Augeas's dung, or else to drive away a sort of dangerous fowl, who have a perverse inclination to plunder the best branches of the tree of knowledge, like those Stymphalian birds that ate up the fruit. These reasonings will furnish us with an adequate definition of a true critic, that he is a discoverer and collector of writers' faults, which may be further put beyond dispute by the following demonstration: that whoever will examine the writings and all kinds wherewith this ancient sect hath honoured the world, shall immediately find, from the whole thread and tenor of them, that the ideas of the authors have been altogether conversant and taken up with the faults, and blemishes, and oversights, and mistakes of other writers, and let the subject treated on be whatever it will. Their imaginations are so entirely possessed and replete with the defects of other pens, that the very quintessence of what is bad does of necessity distil into their own, by which means the whole appears to be nothing else but an abstract of the criticisms themselves have made. Having thus briefly considered the original and office of a critic, as the word is understood in its most noble and universal acception, I proceed to refute the objections of those who argue from the silence and pretermission of authors, by which they pretend to prove that the very art of criticism, as now exercised, and by me explained, is wholly modern, and consequently that the critics of Great Britain and France have no title to an original so ancient and illustrious as I have deduced. Now, if I can clearly make out, on the contrary, that the most ancient writers have particularly described both the person and the office of a true critic agreeable to the definition laid down by me, their grand objection from the silence of authors will fall to the ground. I confess to have for a long time borne a part in this general error, from which I should never have acquitted myself. But through the assistance of our noble moderns, whose most edifying volumes I turn indefatigably over night and day, for the improvement of my mind and the good of my country, these have with unwearied pains made many useful searches into the weak sides of the ancients, given us a comprehensive list of them. Besides, they have proved beyond contradiction that the very finest things delivered of old have been long since invented and brought to light by much later pens, and that the noblest discoveries those ancients ever made in art or nature have all been produced by the transcending genius of the present age, which clearly shows how little merit those ancients can justly pretend to, and takes off that blind admiration paid them by men in a corner, who have the unhappiness of conversing too little with present things. Reflecting maturely upon all this, and taking in the whole compass of human nature, I easily concluded that these ancients, highly sensible of their many imperfections, must needs have endeavoured, from some passages in their works, to obviate, soften, or divert the censorious reader, by satire or panegyric upon the true critics, in imitation of their masters, the moderns. Now, in the commonplaces of both these, I was plentifully instructed by a long course of useful study in prefaces and prologues, and therefore immediately resolved to try what I could discover of either, by a diligent perusal of the most ancient writers, and especially those who treated of the earliest times. Here I found to my great surprise that although they all entered upon occasion into particular descriptions of the true critic, according as they were governed by their fears or their hopes, yet whatever they touched of that kind was with abundance of caution, adventuring no further than mythology and hieroglyphic. This, I suppose, gave ground to superficial readers for urging the silence of authors against the antiquity of the true critic, though the types are so apposite, and the applications so necessary and natural, that it is not easy to conceive how any reader of modern eye and taste could overlook them. I shall venture from a great number to produce a few which I am very confident will put this question beyond doubt. It well deserves considering that these ancient writers, in treating enigmatically upon this subject, have generally fixed upon the very same hieroglyph, varying only the story according to their affectations or their wit. For first, Pausanias is of opinion that the perfection of writing correct was entirely owing to the institution of critics, and that he can possibly mean no other than the true critic is, I think, manifest enough from the following description. He says they were a race of men who delighted to nibble at the superfluities and excrescencies of books, which the learned at length observing took warning of their own accord to lop the luxuriant, the rotten, the dead, the sapless, and the overgrown branches from their works. But now all this he cunningly shades under the following allegory, that the Nauplians in Argia learned the art of pruning their vines by observing that when an ass had browsed upon one of them, it thrived the better and bore fairer fruit. But Herodotus, holding the very same hieroglyph, speaks much plainer and almost in terminis. He hath been so bold as to tax the true critics of ignorance and malice, telling us openly, for I think nothing can be plainer, that in the western part of Libya there were asses with horns, upon which relation Ctesias yet refines, mentioning the very same animal about India, adding that whereas all other asses wanted a gall, these horned ones were so redundant in that part that their flesh was not to be eaten because of extreme bitterness. Now the reason why those ancient writers treated this subject only by types and figures was because they durst not make open attacks against a party so potent and so terrible as the critics of those ages were, whose very voice was so dreadful that a legion of authors would tremble and drop their pens at the sound. For so Herodotus tells us expressly in another place, how a vast army of Scythians was put to flight in a panic terror by the braying of an ass. From hence it is conjectured by certain profound philologers that the great awe and reverence paid to a true critic by the writers of Britain have been derived to us from those our Scythian ancestors. In short, this dread was so universal that in process of time those authors who had a mind to publish their sentiments more freely in describing the true critics of their several ages were forced to leave off the use of the former hieroglyph as too nearly approaching the prototype, and invented other terms instead, thereof that were more cautious and mystical. So Diodorus, speaking to the same purpose, ventures no farther than to say that in the mountains of Helicon there grows a certain weed, which bears a flower of so damned a scent as to poison those who offer to smell it. Lucretius gives exactly the same relation. Est etiam in magnis Heliconis montibus arbus, floris odore hominem retro consueta necare. But Ctesias, whom we lately quoted, has been a great deal bolder, who had been used with much severity by the true critics of his own age, and therefore could not forbear to leave behind him at least one deep mark of his vengeance against the whole tribe. His meaning is so near the surface that I wonder how it possibly came to be overlooked by those who deny the antiquity of the true critics. For pretending to make a description of many strange animals about India, he has set down these remarkable words. Among the rest, says he, there is a serpent that wants teeth, and consequently cannot bite, but if its vomit, to which it is much addicted, happens to fall upon anything, a certain rottenness or corruption ensues. These serpents are generally found among the mountains where jewels grow, and they frequently emit a poisonous juice, whereof whoever drinks, that person's brain flies out of his nostrils. There was also among the ancients a sort of critic, not distinguished in specie from the former, but in growth or degree, who seem to have been only the tyros or junior scholars, yet because of their differing employments they are frequently mentioned as a sect by themselves. The usual exercise of these young students was to attend constantly at theatres, and learn to spy out the worst parts of the play, whereof they were obliged carefully to take note, and render a rational account to their tutors. Fleshed at these smaller sports, like young wolves, they grew up in time to be nimble and strong enough for hunting down large game. For it has been observed, both among ancients and moderns, that a true critic has one quality in common with a whore and an alderman, never to change his title or his name, that a grey critic has been certainly a green one, the perfections and acquirements of his age being only the improved talents of his youth, like hemp, which some naturalists inform us is bad for suffocations, though taken but in the seed. I esteem the invention, or at least the refinement of prologues, to have been owing to these younger proficients, of whom Terence makes frequent and honourable mention under the name of Malevoly. Now it is certain the institution of the true critics was of absolute necessity to the commonwealth of learning. For all human actions seem to be divided like Themistocles and his company. One man can fiddle, another can make a small town a great city, and he that cannot do either one or the other deserves to be kicked out of the creation. The avoiding of which penalty has doubtless given the first birth to the nation of critics, and withal an occasion for their secret detractors to report that a true critic is a sort of mechanic, set up with a stock and tools for his trade, at as little expense as a tailor, and that there is much analogy between the utensils and abilities of both. That the tailor's hell is the type of a critic's commonplace book, and his wit and learning held forth by the goose. That it requires at least as many of these to the making up of one scholar as of the others to the composition of a man. That the valour of both is equal, and their weapons near of a size. Much may be said in answer to these invidious reflections, and I can positively affirm the first to be a falsehood. For on the contrary, nothing is more certain than it requires greater layings out to be free of the critic's company than of any other you can name. For as to be a true beggar, it will cost the richest candidate every groat he is worth, so before one can commence a true critic, it will cost a man all the good qualities of his mind, which perhaps for a less purchase would be thought but an indifferent bargain. Having thus amply proved the antiquity of criticism and described the primitive state of it, I shall now examine the present condition of this empire, and show how well it agrees with its ancient self. A certain author, whose works have many ages since been entirely lost, does in his 5th book and 8th chapter say of critics that their writings are the mirrors of learning. This I understand in a literal sense, and suppose our author must mean that whosoever designs to be a perfect writer must inspect into the books of critics and correct his inventions there as in a mirror. Now whoever considers that the mirrors of the ancients were made of brass and fine mercurio, may presently apply the two principal qualifications of a true modern critic, and consequently must needs conclude that these have always been and must be forever the same. For brass is an emblem of duration, and when it is skilfully burnished will cast reflections from its own superficies without any assistance of mercury from behind. All the other talents of a critic will not require a particular mention, being included or easily deducible to these. However, I shall conclude with 3 maxims, which may serve both as characteristics to distinguish a true modern critic from a pretender, and will be also of admirable use to those worthy spirits who engage in so useful and honourable an art. The first is that critics, contrary to all other faculties of the intellect, is ever held the truest and best when it is the very first result of the critic's mind, as fowlers reckon the first aim for the surest, and seldom fail of missing the mark if they stay not for a second. Secondly, the true critics are known by their talent of swarming about the noblest writers to which they are carried merely by instinct, as a rat to the best cheese, or a wasp to the fairest fruit. So when the king is a horseback, he is sure to be the dirtiest person of the company, and they that make their court best are such as bespatter him most. Lastly, a true critic, in the perusal of a book, is like a dog at a feast, whose thoughts and stomach are wholly set upon what the guests fling away, and consequently is apt to snarl most when they are the fewest bones. Thus much I think is sufficient to serve by way of address to my patrons, the true modern critics, and may very well atone for my past silence, as well as that which I am like to observe for the future. I hope I have deserved so well of their whole body as to meet with generous and tender usage at their hands. Supported by which expectation, I go on boldly to pursue those adventures already so happily begun. End of section 3. Section 4 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. I have now with much pains and study conducted the reader to a period where he must expect to hear of great revolutions. For no sooner had our learned brother, so often mentioned, got a warm house of his own over his head, than he began to look big and to take mightily upon him, insomuch that unless the gentle reader, out of his great candour, will please a little to exalt his idea, I am afraid he will henceforth hardly know the hero of the play, when he happens to meet him, his part, his dress, and his mien being so much altered. He told his brothers he would have them to know that he was their elder, and consequently his father's sole heir. Nay, a while after he would not allow them to call him brother, but Mr. Peter. And then he must be styled Father Peter, and sometimes my Lord Peter. To support this grandeur, which he soon began to consider could not be maintained without a better fond than what he was born to, after much thought he cast about at last to turn projector and virtuoso, wherein he so well succeeded that many famous discoveries, projects, and machines which bear great vogue and practice at present in the world are owing entirely to Lord Peter's invention. I will deduce the best account I have been able to collect of the chief amongst them, without considering much the order they came out in, because I think authors are not well agreed as to that point. I hope, when this treatise of mine shall be translated into foreign languages, as I may without vanity affirm that the labour of collecting, the faithfulness in recounting, and the great usefulness of the matter to the public will amply deserve that justice, that of the several academies abroad, especially those of France and Italy, will favourably accept these humble offers for the advancement of universal knowledge. I do also advertise the most reverend fathers, the Eastern missionaries, that I have purely for their sakes made use of such words and phrases as will best admit any easy turn into any of the Oriental languages, especially the Chinese. And so I proceed with great content of mind upon reflecting how much emolument this whole globe of earth is like to reap by my labours. The first undertaking of Lord Peter was to purchase a large continent, lately said to have been discovered in terra australis incognita. The tract of land he bought at a very great pennyworth from the discoverers themselves, though some pretended to doubt whether they had ever been there, and then retailed it into several cantons to certain dealers, who carried over colonies, but were all shipwrecked in the voyage. Upon which Lord Peter sold the said continent to other customers again and again, and again, and again, with the same success. The second project I shall mention was his sovereign remedy for the worms, especially those in the spleen. The patient was to eat nothing after supper for 3 nights. As soon as he went to bed, he was carefully to lie on one side, and when he grew weary, to turn upon the other. He must also duly confine his 2 eyes to the same object, by no means break wind at both ends together, without manifest occasion. These prescriptions diligently observed, the worms would void insensibly by perspiration ascending through the brain. A third invention was the erecting of a whispering office, for the public good and ease of all such as are hypochondriacal or troubled with the colic, as likewise of all eavesdroppers, physicians, midwives, small politicians, friends fallen out, repeating poets, lovers happy or in despair, bawds, privy councillors, pages, parasites and buffoons, in short, all such as were in danger of bursting with too much wind. An ass's head was placed so conveniently that the party affected might easily with his mouth accost either of the animal's ears, which he was to apply close for a certain space, and by a fugitive faculty peculiar to the ears of that animal receive immediate benefit, either by eructation or expiration or evomission. Another very beneficial project of Lord Peter's was an office of insurance for tobacco pipes, martyrs of the modern zeal, volumes of poetry, shadows, and rivers, that these nor any of these shall receive damage by fire. From whence our friendly societies may plainly find themselves to be only transcribers from this original, though the one and the other have been of great benefit to the undertakers as well as of equal to the public. Lord Peter was also held the original author of puppets and raree shows, the great usefulness whereof being so generally known, I shall not enlarge farther upon this particular. But another discovery for which he was much renowned was his famous universal pickle. For having remarked how your common pickle in use among housewives was of no further benefit than to preserve dead flesh and certain kinds of vegetables, Peter, with great cost as well as art, had contrived a pickle proper for houses, gardens, towns, men, women, children, and cattle, wherein he could preserve them as sound as insects in amber, Now this pickle to the taste, the smell, and the sight appeared exactly the same with what is in common service for beef and butter and herrings, and has been often that way applied with great success, but for its may sovereign virtues was quite a different thing. For Peter would put in a certain quantity of his powder, pimpelim pimp, after which it never failed of success. The operation was performed by sparge fraction in a proper time of the moon. The patient who was to be pickled, if it were a house, would infallibly be preserved from all spiders, rats, and weasels. If the party affected were a dog, he should be exempt from mange and madness and hunger. It also infallibly took away all scabs and lice and scald heads from children, never hindering the patient from any duty either at bed or board. But of all Peter's rarities he most valued a certain set of bulls, whose race was by great fortune preserved in a lineal descent from those that guarded the Golden Fleece, though some who pretended to observe them curiously doubted the breed had not been kept entirely chaste, because they had degenerated from their ancestors in some qualities, and had acquired others very extraordinary, but a foreign mixture. The bulls of Colchis are recorded to have brazen feet, but whether it happened by ill pasture and running, by an ally from intervention of other parents from stolen intrigues, whether a weakness in their progenitors had impaired the seminal virtue, or by decline necessary through a long course of time, the originals of nature being depraved in these latter sinful ages of the world, whatever was the cause, it is certain that Lord Peter's bulls were extremely vitiated by the rust of time in the metal of their feet, which was now sunk into common lead. However, the terrible roaring peculiar to their lineage was preserved, as likewise that faculty of breathing out fire from their nostrils, which notwithstanding many of their detractors took to be a feat of art, and to be nothing so terrible as it appeared, proceeding only from their usual course of diet, which was of squibs and crackers. However, they had two peculiar marks which extremely distinguished them from the bulls of Jason, and which I have not met together in the description of any other monster beside that in Horace varius indicere plumus and atrum definit in picem, for these had fishes' tails, yet upon occasion could outfly any bird in the air. Peter put these bulls upon several employs. Sometimes he would set them a-roaring to fright naughty boys and make them quiet. Sometimes he would send them out upon errands of great importance, where it is wonderful to recount, and perhaps the cautious reader may think much to believe it, an appetitus sensibilis deriving itself through the whole family from their noble ancestors, guardians of the Golden Fleece. They continued so extremely fond of gold, that if Peter sent them abroad, though it were only upon a compliment, they would roar and spit and belch and snivel out fire, and keep a perpetual coil till you flung them a bit of gold. But then pulveris exigui jactu, they would grow calm and quiet as lambs. In short, whether by secret connivance or encouragement from their master, or out of their own liquorish affection to gold, or both, it is certain they were no better than a sort of sturdy, swaggering beggars, and where they could not prevail to get an alms, would make women miscarry and children fall into fits, who to this very day usually call sprites and hobgoblins by the name of bull-beggars. They grew at last so very troublesome to the neighbourhood, that some gentleman of the north-west got a parcel of right English bulldogs, and baited them so terribly that they felt it ever after. I must needs mention one more of Lord Peter's projects, which was very extraordinary. It discovered him to be master of a high reach and profound invention. Whenever it happened that any rogue of Newgate was condemned to be hanged, Peter would offer him a pardon for a certain sum of money, which, when the poor caitiff had made all shifts to scrape up and send, his lordship would return a piece of paper in this form: "To all mayors, sheriffs, jailers, constables, bailiffs, hangmen, etc. Whereas we are informed that A.B. remains in the hands of you, or any of you, under the sentence of death, we will and command you, upon sight hereof, to let the said prisoner depart to his own habitation, whether he stands condemned for murder, sodomy, rape, sacrilege, incest, treason, blasphemy, etc., for which this shall be your sufficient warrant, and it you fail hereof, God damn you and yours to all eternity, and so we bid you heartily farewell, you most humble man's man, Emperor Peter. The wretches, trusting to this, lost their lives and money too. I desire of those whom the learned among posterity will appoint for commentators upon this elaborate treatise, that they will proceed with great caution upon certain dark points, wherein all who are not vere adepti may be in danger to form rash and hasty conclusions, especially in some mysterious paragraphs, where certain arcana are joined for brevity's sake, which in the operation must be divided. And I am certain that future sons of art will return large thanks to my memory for so grateful, so useful an innuendo. It will be no difficult part to persuade the reader that so many worthy discoveries met with great success in the world, though I may justly assure him that I have related much the smallest number, my design having been only to single out such as will be of most benefit for public imitation, but which best serve to give some idea of the reach and wit of the inventor. And therefore it need not be wondered if by this time Lord Peter was become exceeding rich. But alas, he had kept his brain so long and so violently upon the rack, that at last it shook itself and began to turn round for a little ease. In short, what with pride, projects, and knavery, poor Peter was grown distracted, and conceived the strangest imaginations in the world. In the height of his fits, as it is usual with those who run mad out of pride, he would call himself God Almighty, and sometimes monarch of the universe. I have seen him, says my author, take 3 old high-crowned hats and clap them all on his head, 3-story high, with a huge bunch of keys at his girdle, and an angling rod in his hand. In which guise, whoever went to take him by the hand in the way of salutation, Peter, with much grace, like a well-educated spaniel, would present them with his foot, and if they refused his civility, then he would raise it as high as their chops, and give them a damned kick in the mouth, which hath ever since been called a salute. Whoever walked by without paying him their compliments, having a wonderful strong breath, he would blow their hats off into the dirt. Meanwhile his affairs at home went upside down, and his 2 brothers had a wretched time, where his first boutade was to kick both their wives one morning out of doors, and his own too, and in their stead gave orders to pick up the first 3 strollers could be met with in the streets. A while after he nailed up the cellar door, and would not allow his brothers a drop of drink to their victuals. Dining one day at an alderman's in the city, Peter observed him expatiating, after the manner of his brethren, in the praises of his sirloin. "Beef," said the sage magistrate, "is the king of meat. Beef comprehends in it the quintessence of partridge, and quail, and venison, and pheasant, and plum pudding, and custard." When Peter came home, he would needs take the fancy of cooking up this doctrine into use, and apply the precept in default of a sirloin to his brown loaf. "Bread," says he, "dear brothers, is the staff of life, in which bread is contained inclusive the quintessence of beef, mutton, veal, venison, partridge, plum pudding, and custard, and to render all complete, there is intermingled a due quantity of water, whose crudities are also corrected by yeast of balm, through which means it becomes a wholesome fermented liquor diffused through the mass of the bread." Upon the strength of these conclusions, next day at dinner was the brown loaf served up in all the formality of a city feast. "Come, brothers," said Peter, "fall to and spare not. He is excellent good mutton, or hold now my hand is in, I'll help you." At which word, in much ceremony, with fork and knife, he carves out 2 good slices of a loaf, and presents each on a plate to his brothers. The elder of the 2, not suddenly entering into Lord Peter's conceit, began with very civil language to examine the mystery. "My lord," said he, "I doubt, with great submission, there may be some mistake." "What!" says Peter, "you are pleasant. Come then, let us hear this jest your head is so big with." "None in the world, my lord, but unless I am very much deceived,
Your lordship was pleased in a while ago to let fall a word about mutton, and I would be glad to see it with all my heart." "Now," said Peter, appearing in great surprise, "I do not comprehend this at all." Upon which the younger, interposing to set the business right, "My lord," said he, "my brother, I suppose, is hungry, and longs for the mutton your lordship hath promised us to dinner." "Pray," said Peter, "take me along with you. Either you are both mad, or disposed to be merrier than I approve of. If you there do not like your piece, I will carve you another, though I should take that to be the choice bit of the whole shoulder." "What then, my lord?" replied the first. "It seems as though the shoulder of mutton all this while." "Pray, sir," said Peter, "eat your victuals, and leave off your impertinence, if you please, for I am not disposed to relish it at present."
Being over-provoked at the affected seriousness of Peter's countenance, "My lord," said he, "I can only say that to my eyes, and fingers, and teeth, and nose, it seems to be nothing but a crust of bread." Upon which the second put in his words, "I never saw a piece of mutton in my life so nearly resembling a slice from a 12-penny loaf." "Look ye, gentlemen," cries Peter in a rage, "to convince you what a couple of blind, positive, ignorant, wilful puppies you are, I will use but this plain argument. By God, it is true, good natural mutton as any in Leadenhall Market, and God confound you both eternally if you offer to believe otherwise." Such a thundering proof as this left no further room for objection. The two unbelievers began to gather and pocket up their mistake as hastily as they could. "Why, truly," said the first, "upon more mature consideration—" "Ay," says the other, interrupting him, "now I have thought better on the thing, your lordship seems to have a great deal of reason." "Very well," said Peter. "Here, boy, fill me a beer glass of claret. Here's to you both, with all my heart." The two brethren, much delighted to see him so readily appeased, returned their most humble thanks, and said they would be glad to pledge his lordship. "That you shall," said Peter. "I am not a person to refuse you anything that is reasonable. Wine, moderately taken, is a cordial. Here is a glass apiece for you. It is true natural juice from the grape, none of your damned vintner's brewings." Having spoke thus, he presented to each of them another large dry crust, bidding them drink it off, and not be bashful, for it would do them no hurt. The two brothers, having after performed the usual office in such delicate conjunctures of staring a sufficient period at Lord Peter and each other, and finding how matters were like to go, resolved not to enter on a new dispute, but let him carry the point as he pleased, for he was now got into one of his mad fits, and to argue or expostulate further would only serve to render him 100 times more untractable. I have chosen to relate this worthy matter in all its circumstances, because it gave a principal occasion to that great and famous rupture which happened about the same time among these brethren, and was never afterwards made up, but of that I shall treat at large in another section. However, it is certain that Lord Peter, even in his lucid intervals, was very lewdly given in his common conversation, extremely wilful and positive, and would at any time rather argue to the death than allow himself to be once in an error. Besides, he had an abominable faculty of telling huge palpable lies upon all occasions, and swearing not only to the truth, but cursing the whole company to hell if they pretended to make the least scruple of believing him. One time he swore he had a cow at home, which gave as much milk at a meal as would fill 3,000 churches, and what was yet more extraordinary, would never turn sour. Another time he was telling of an old signpost that belonged to his father, with the nails and timber enough on it to build 16 large men of war. Talking one day of Chinese wagons, which are made so light as to sail over mountains, "Zounds," said Peter, "where's the wonder of that? By God, I saw a large house of lime and stone travel over sea and land, granting that it stopped sometimes to bait above 2,000 German leagues. And that which was the good of it, he would swear desperately all the while that he never told a lie in his life, and at every word, 'By God, gentlemen, I tell you nothing but the truth
and the devil broil them eternally that will not believe me. In short, Peter grew so scandalous that all the neighbourhood began to plain words to say he was no better than a knave, and his two brothers, long weary of his ill usage, resolved at last to leave him. But first they humbly desired a copy of their father's will, which they had now lain by neglected time out of mind. Instead of granting this request, he called them rogues, traitors, and the rest of the vile names he could muster up. However, while he was abroad one day upon his projects, the two youngsters watched their opportunity, and made a shift to come at the will, and took a copia vera, by which they presently saw how grossly they had been abused, their father having left them equal heirs, and strictly commanded that whatever they got should lie in common among them all. Pursuant to which, their next enterprise was to break open the cellar door, and get a little good drink to spirit and comfort their hearts. In copying the will they had met another precept against whoring, divorce, and separate maintenance, upon which their next work was to discard their concubines and send for their wives. Whilst all this was in agitation, there enters a solicitor from Newgate, desiring Lord Peter would please to procure a pardon for a thief that was to be hanged tomorrow. But the two brothers told him he was a coxcomb to seek pardons from a fellow who deserved to be hanged much better than his client, and discovered all the method of that imposture in the same form I delivered it a while ago, advising the solicitor to put his friend upon obtaining a pardon from the king. In the midst of all this clatter and revolution, in comes Peter with a file of dragoons at his heels, and gathering from all hands what was in the wind, he and his gang, after several millions of scurrilities and curses not very important here to repeat, by main force very fairly kicks them both out of doors, would never let them come under his roof from that day to this. End of section 4. Section 5 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. A digression in the modern kind. We whom the world is pleased to honour with the title of modern authors should never have been able to compass our great design of an everlasting remembrance and never dying fame, if our endeavours had not been so highly serviceable to the general good of mankind. This, O universe, is the adventurous attempt of me, thy secretary. Quem vis perferre laborem suadet et inducit noctes vigilare seras. To this end I have some time since, with a world of pains and art, dissected the carcass of human nature, and read many useful lectures upon the several parts, both containing and contained, till at last it smelt so strong I could preserve it no longer. Upon which I have been at a great expense to fit up all the bones with exact contexture and in due symmetry, so that I am ready to show a very complete anatomy thereof to all curious gentlemen and others. But not to digress further in the midst of a digression, as I have known some authors enclose digressions in one another, like a nest of boxes, I do affirm that, having carefully cut up human nature, I found a very strange and important discovery, that the public good of mankind is performed by two ways, instruction and diversion. And I have further proved my said several readings, which perhaps the world may one day hear, if I can prevail on any friend to steal a copy, or on certain gentlemen of my admirers to be very importunate, that as mankind is now disposed, he receives much greater advantage by being diverted than instructed, his epidemical diseases being fastidiosity, amorphy, and occitation, whereas in the present universal empire of wit and learning there seems but little matter left for instruction. However, in compliance with a lesson of great age and authority, I have attempted carrying the point in all its heights, and accordingly throughout this divine treatise have skilfully kneaded up both together with a layer of utile and a layer of dulce. When I consider how exceedingly our illustrious moderns have eclipsed the weak glimmering lights of the ancients, and turned them out of the road of all fashionable commerce, to a degree that our choice town wits of most refined accomplishments are in grave dispute whether there have been ever any ancients or no, in which point we are like to receive wonderful satisfaction from the most useful labours and lucubrations of that worthy modern Dr. Bentley. I say, when I consider all this, I cannot but bewail that no famous modern hath ever yet attempted an universal system in a small portable volume of all things that are to be known, or believed, or imagined, or practised in life. I am, however, forced to acknowledge that such an enterprise was thought on some time ago by a great philosopher of Brazil. The method he proposed was by a certain curious receipt, a nostrum, which after his untimely death I found among his papers, and do here, out of my great affection to the modern learned, present them with it, not doubting it may one day encourage some worthy undertaker. You take fair correct copies, well bound in calf's skin, and lettered at the back, of all modern bodies of arts and sciences whatsoever, and in what language you please. These you distill in balneo Mariae, infusing quintessence of poppy, QS, together with 3 pints of lether, to be had from the apothecaries. You cleanse away carefully the sordes and caput mortuum, letting all that is volatile evaporate. You preserve only the first running, which is again to be distilled 17 times, till what remains will amount to about 2 drams. This you keep in a glass vial hermetically sealed for 21 days. Then you begin your Catholic treatise, taking every morning fasting, first shaking the vial, 3 drops of this elixir, snuffing it strongly up your nose. It will dilate itself about the brain, where there is any, in 14 minutes, and you immediately perceive in your head an infinite number of abstracts, summaries, compendiums, extracts, collections, medullas, excertaque deums, florilegias, and the like, all disposed into great order and reducible upon paper. I must needs own it was by the assistance of this arcanum that I, though otherwise impar, have adventured upon so daring an attempt, never achieved or undertaken before, but by a certain author called Homer, in whom, though otherwise a person not without some abilities, and for an ancient of a tolerable genius, I have discovered many gross errors, which are not to be forgiven his very ashes, if by chance any of them are left. For whereas we are assured he designed his work for a complete body of all knowledge, human, divine, political, and mechanic, it is manifest he hath wholly neglected some, and been very imperfect, perfect in the rest. For, first of all, as eminent a Kabbalist as his disciples would represent him, his account of the opus magnum is extremely poor and deficient. He seems to have read very superficially either Sendivogus, Behmen, or Anthroposophia Theomagica. He is also quite mistaken about the Sphera Pyroplastica, a neglect not to be atoned for, and, if the reader will admit so severe a censure, Vix crederum autorem hunc unquam antivisse ignis vocem. These failings are not less prominent in several parts of the mechanics, for having read his writings with the utmost application, usual among modern wits, I could never yet discover the least direction about the structure of that useful instrument, a sabor, for want of which, if the moderns had not lent their assistance, we might yet have wandered in the dark. But I have still behind a fault far more notorious to tax this author with. I mean his gross ignorance in the common laws of this realm, and in the doctrine as well as discipline of the Church of England. Defect indeed for which both he and all the ancients stand most justly censured by my worthy and ingenious friend Mr. Wotton, Bachelor of Divinity, in his incomparable Treatise of Ancient and Modern Learning, a book never to be sufficiently valued, whether we consider the happy turns and flowings of the author's wit, the great usefulness of his sublime discoveries upon the subject of flies and spittle, or the laborious eloquence of his style. And I cannot forbear doing that author the justice of my public acknowledgments of the great helps and liftings I had out of his incomparable piece while I was penning this treatise. But besides these omissions in Homer already mentioned, the curious reader will also observe several defects in that author's writings for which he is not altogether so accountable. For whereas every branch of knowledge has received such wonderful acquirements since his age, especially within these last 3 years or thereabouts, it is almost impossible he could be so very perfect in modern discoveries as his advocates pretend. We freely acknowledge him to be the inventor of the compass, of gunpowder, and the circulation of the blood, but I challenge any of his admirers to show me in all his writings a complete account of the spleen. Does he not also leave us wholly to seek in the art of political wagering? What can be more defective and unsatisfactory than his long dissertation upon tea? and as to his method of salvation without mercury, so much celebrated of late, it is my own knowledge and experience a thing very little to be relied on. It was to supply such momentous defects that I have been prevailed on, after long solicitation, to take pen in hand, and I dare venture to promise the judicious reader to find nothing neglected here that can be of use upon any emergency of life. I am confident to have included and exhausted all that human imagination can rise or fall to. Particularly, I recommend to the perusal of the learned certain discoveries wholly untouched by others, whereof I shall only mention, among a great many more, my New Help of Smatterers, or the Art of Deep Learned and Shallow Read, a curious invention about mousetraps, a universal rule of reason, or every man has his carver, together with a most useful engine for catching of owls. All which the judicious reader will find largely treated on in the several parts of this discourse. I hold myself obliged to give as much light as possible into the beauties and excellencies of what I am writing, because it is become the fashion and humour most applauded among the first authors of this polite and learned age, when they would correct the ill nature of critical or inform the ignorance of courteous readers. Besides, there have been several famous pieces lately published, both in verse and prose, wherein if the writers had not been pleased, out of their great humanity and affection to the public, to give us a nice detail of the sublime and the admirable they contain, it is 1,000 to 1 whether we should ever have discovered another grain of either. For my own particular, I cannot deny that whatever I have said upon this occasion had been more proper in a preface, and more agreeable to the mode which usually directs it there. But I here think fit to lay hold on that great and honourable privilege of being the last writer. I claim an absolute authority in right as the freshest modern, which gives me a despotic power over all authors before me, in the strength of which title I do utterly disapprove, and declare against that pernicious custom of making the preface a bill of fare to the book. For I have always looked upon it as a high point of indiscretion in monstermongers and other retailers of strange sights to hang out a fair, large picture over the door, drawn after the life, with a most eloquent description underneath. This has saved me many a threepence, for my curiosity was fully satisfied, and I have offered to go in, though often invited by the urging and attending orator with his last moving and standing piece of rhetoric. "Sir, upon my word, we are just going to begin." Such is exactly the fate at this time of prefaces, epistles, advertisements, introductions, prolegomenas, apparatuses to the readerises. This expedient was admirable at first. Our great Drayton has long carried it as far as it would go, and with incredible success. He has often said to me in confidence that the whole world would never have suspected him to be so great a poet if he had not assured them so frequently in his prefaces that it was impossible they could either doubt or forget it. Perhaps it may be so. However, I much fear his instructions have edified out of their place, and taught men to grow wiser in certain points where he never intended they should. For it is lamentable to behold with what a lazy scorn many of the yawning readers in our age do nowadays twirl over 40 or 50 pages of preface and dedication, which is the usual modern stint, as if it was so much Latin. Though it must be also allowed, on the other hand, that a very considerable number is known to precede critics and wits by reading nothing else, into which two factions I think all present readers may justly be divided. Now for myself, I profess to be of the former sort, and therefore, having the modern inclination to expatiate upon the beauty of my own productions, and display the bright parts of my discourse, I thought best to do it in the body of the work, where as it now lies it makes a very considerable addition to the bulk of the volume, a circumstance by no means to be neglected by a skilful writer. Having thus paid my due deference and acknowledgment to an established custom of our newest authors, by a long digression unsought for, and a universal censure unprovoked, by forcing into the light with much pains and dexterity my own excellencies and other men's defaults, with great justice to myself and candour to them, I now happily resume my subject to the infinite satisfaction both of the reader and the author. End of section 5. Section 6 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. We left Lord Peter in open rupture with his two brethren, both for ever discarded from his house, and resigned to the wide world with little or nothing to trust to, which are circumstances that render them proper subjects for the charity of a writer's pen to work on, scenes of misery ever affording the fairest harvest for great adventures. And in this the world may perceive the difference between the integrity of a generous author and that of a common friend. The latter is observed to adhere close in prosperity, but on the decline of fortune to drop suddenly off, whereas the generous author, just on the contrary, finds his hero on the dunghill, from thence, by gradual steps, raises him to a throne, and then immediately withdraws, expecting not so much as thanks for his pains. In imitation of which example I have placed Lord Peter in a noble house, given him a title to wear and money to spend. There I shall leave him for some time, returning where common charity directs me to the assistance of his two brothers at the lowest ebb. However, I shall by no means forget my character of a historian, to follow the truth step by step, whatever happens or wherever it may lead me. The two exiles, so nearly united in fortune and interest, took a lodging together, where at their first leisure they began to reflect on the numberless misfortunes and vexations of their life past, and could not tell of the sudden to what failure in their conduct they ought to impute them, when after some recollection they called to mind a copy of their father's will, which they had so happily recovered. This was immediately produced, and a firm resolution taken between them to alter whatever was already amiss, and reduce all their future measures to the strictest obedience prescribed therein. The main body of the will, as the reader cannot easily have forgot, consisted in certain admirable rules about the wearing of their coats, in the perusal whereof the two brothers at every period, duly comparing the doctrine with the practice, there was never seen a wider difference between two things, horrible, downright transgressions of every point, upon which they both resolved, without further delay, to follow immediately upon reducing the whole exactly after their father's model. But here it is good to stop the hasty reader, ever impatient to see the end of an adventure before we writers can duly prepare him for it. I am to record that these two brothers began to be distinguished at this time by certain names. One of them desired to be called Martin, and the other took the appellation of Jack. These two had lived in much friendship and agreement under the tyranny of their brother Peter, as it is the talent of fellow sufferers to do, men in misfortune being like men in the dark, to whom all colours are the same. But when they came forward into the world, and began to display themselves to each other and to the light, their complexions appeared extremely different, which the present posture of their affairs gave them sudden opportunity to discover. But here the severe reader may justly tax me as a writer of short memory, a deficiency to which a true modern cannot but of necessity be a little subject. Because memory, being an employment of the mind upon things past, is a faculty for which the learned in our illustrious age have no manner of occasion, who deal entirely with invention and strike all things out of themselves, or at least by collision from each other, upon which account we think it highly reasonable to produce our great forgetfulness as an argument unanswerable for our great wit. I ought in method to have informed the reader about 50 pages ago of a fancy Lord Peter took and infused into his brothers to wear on their coats whatever trimmings came up in fashion, never pulling off any as they went out of the mode, but keeping on all together, which amounted in time to a medley the most antique you could possibly conceive, and this to a degree that upon the time of their falling out there was hardly a thread of the original coat to be seen, but an infinite quantity of lace and ribbons and fringe and embroidery and points. I mean only those tagged with silver, for the rest fell off. Now this material circumstance having been forgot in due place, as good fortune hath ordered, comes in very properly here, when the two brothers are just going to reform their vestures into the primitive state prescribed by their father's will. They both unanimously entered upon this great work, looking sometimes on their coats and sometimes on the will. Martin laid the first hand, one twitch brought off a large handful of points, and with the second pull stripped away 10 dozen yards of fringe. But when he had gone thus far, he demurred a while. He knew very well there yet remained a great deal more to be done. However, the first heat being over, his violence began to cool, and he resolved to proceed more moderately in the rest of the work, having already very narrowly escaped a swinging rent in pulling off the points, which, being tagged with silver, as we have observed before, the judicious workman had with much sagacity double sewn to preserve them from falling. Resolving therefore to rid his coat of a huge quantity of gold lace, he picked up the stitches with much caution, and diligently gleaned out all the loose threads as he went, which proved to be a work of time. Then he fell about the embroidered Indian figures of men, women, and children, against which, as you have heard in its due place, their father's testament was extremely exact and severe. These, with much dexterity and application, were after a while quite eradicated, or utterly defaced. For the rest, where he observed the embroidery to be worked so close as not to be got away without damaging the cloth, or where it served to hide or strengthen any flaw in the body of the coat, contracted by the perpetual tampering of workmen upon it, he concluded the wisest course was to let it remain, resolving in no case whatsoever that the substance of the stuff should suffer injury, which he thought the best method for serving the true intent and meaning of his father's will. And this is the nearest account I have been able to collect of Martin's proceedings upon this great revolution. But his brother Jack, whose adventures will be so extraordinary as to furnish a great part in the remainder of this discourse, entered upon the matter with other thoughts and a quite different spirit. For the memory of Lord Peter's injuries produced a degree of hatred and spite which had a much greater share of inciting him than any regards after his father's commands, since these appeared at best only secondary and subservient to the other. However, for this medley of humour he made a shift to find a very plausible name, honouring it with the title of zeal, which is perhaps the most significant word that has been ever yet produced in any language, as, I think, I have fully proved in my excellent analytical discourse upon that subject, wherein I have deduced a historio-physiological account of zeal, showing how it first proceeded from a notion into a word, and from thence in a hot summer ripened into a tangible substance. This work, containing 3 large volumes in folio, I designed very shortly to publish by the modern way of subscription, not doubting but the nobility and gentry of the land will give me all possible encouragement, having already had such a taste of what I am able to perform. I record, therefore, that brother Jack, brimful of this miraculous compound, reflecting with indignation upon Peter's tyranny, and further provoked by the despondency of Martin, prefaced his resolutions to this purpose. "What," said he, "a rogue that locked up his drink, turned away our wives, cheated us of our fortunes, palmed his crusts upon us for mutton, and at last kicked us out of doors, must we be in his fashions? A rascal, besides, that all the street cries out against." Having thus kindled and inflamed himself as high as possible, and by consequence in a delicate temper for beginning a reformation, he set about the work immediately, and in 3 minutes made more dispatch than Martin had done in as many hours. But, courteous reader, you are given to understand that zeal is never so highly obliged as when you set it a-tearing, and Jack, who doted on that quality in himself, allowed it at this time its full swing. Thus it happened that, stripping down a parcel of gold lace a little too hastily, he rent the main body of his coat from top to bottom, and whereas his talent was not of the happiest in taking up a stitch, he knew no better way than to darn it again with packthread, thread, and a skewer. But the matter was yet infinitely worse. I record it with tears. When he proceeded to the embroidery, for being clumsy of nature, and of temper impatient withal, beholding millions of stitches that required the nicest hand and sedatest constitution to extricate, in a great rage he tore off the whole piece, cloth and all, and flung it into the kennel, and furiously thus continuing his career, "Ah, good brother Martin," said he, "do as I do. For the love of God, strip, tear, pull, rend, flay off all that we may appear as unlike that rogue Peter as it is possible. I would not for £100 carry the least mark about me that might give occasion to the neighbours of suspecting I was related to such a rascal." But Martin, who at this time happened to be extremely phlegmatic and sedate, begged his brother of all love not to damage his coat by any means, for he never would get such another, desired him to consider that it was not their business to form their actions by any reflection upon Peter's, but by observing the rules prescribed in their father's will; that he should remember Peter was still their brother, whatever faults or injuries he had committed, and therefore they should by all means avoid such a thought as that of taking measures for good and evil from no other rule than of opposition to him. That it was true, the testament of their good father was very exact in what related to the wearing of their coats, yet was it no less penal and strict in prescribing agreement and friendship and affection between them. And therefore, if straining a point were at all defensible, it would certainly be so rather to the advance of unity than increase of contradiction. Martin had still proceeded as gravely as he began, and doubtless would have delivered an admirable lecture of morality, which might have exceedingly contributed to my reader's repose both of body and mind, the true ultimate end of ethics. But Jack was already gone a flight shot beyond his patience, and as in scholastic disputes, nothing serves to rouse the spleen of him that opposes so much as a kind of pedantic affected calmness in the respondent, disputants being for the most part like unequal scales, where the gravity of one side advances the lightness of the other and causes it to fly up and kick the beam. So it happened here that the weight of Martin's arguments exalted Jack's levity and made him fly out and spurn against his brother's moderation. In short, Martin's patience put Jack in a rage, but that which most afflicted him was to observe his brother's coat so well reduced into the state of innocence, while his own was either wholly rent to a shirt, or those places which had escaped his cruel clutches were still in Peter's livery, so that he looked like a drunken beau, half rifled by bullies, or like a fresh tenant of Newgate when he has refused the payment of garnish, or like a discovered shoplifter, left to the mercy of exchange women, or like a bawd, in her old velvet petticoat, resigned into the secular hands of the mobile. Like any or like all of these medley of rags and lace and fringes, unfortunate Jack did now appear. He would have been extremely glad to see his coat in the condition of Martin's, but infinitely gladder to find that of Martin in the same predicament with his. However, since neither of these was likely to come to pass, he thought fit to lend the whole business another turn, and dress up necessity into a virtue. Therefore, after as many of the fox's arguments as he could muster up for bringing Martin to reason, as he called it, or as he meant it, into his own ragged bobtail condition, and observing, he said, all to little purpose, what alas was left for the forlorn Jack to do, but, after a million of scurrilities against his brother, to run mad with spleen and spite and contradiction. To be short, here began a mortal breach between these two. Jack went immediately to new lodgings, and in a few days it was for certain reported that he ran out of his wits. In a short time after he appeared abroad, and confirmed the report by falling into the oddest whimsies that ever a sick brain conceived. And now the little boys in the streets began to salute him with several names. Sometimes they would call him Jack the Bald, sometimes Jack with a lanthorn, sometimes Dutch Jack, sometimes French Hugh, sometimes Tom the Beggar, sometimes Knocking Jack of the North. And it was under one or some or all of these appellations, which I leave the learned reader to determine, that he hath given rise to the most illustrious and epidemic set of Aeolists, who with their honourable commemoration do still acknowledge the renowned Jack for their author and founder, of whose originals as well as principles I am now advancing to gratify the world with a very particular account. Meleo contingens cuncta lepore. End of section 6. Section 7 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. A digression in praise of digressions. I have sometimes heard of an Iliad in a nutshell, but it has been my fortune to have much oftener seen a nutshell in an Iliad. There is no doubt that human life has received most wonderful advantages from both,
but to which of the two the world is chiefly indebted, I shall leave among the curious as a problem worthy of their utmost inquiry. For the invention of the latter, I think the commonwealth of learning is chiefly obliged to the great modern improvement of digressions, the late refinements in knowledge running parallel to those of diet in our nation, which among men of a judicious taste are dressed up in various compounds consisting in soups and oleos, fricassees and ragouts. It is true there is a sort of morose, detracting, ill-bred people who pretend utterly to disrelish these polite innovations. And as to the similitude from diet, they allow the parallel, but are so bold as to pronounce the example itself a corruption and degeneracy of taste. They tell us that the fashion of jumbling 50 things together in a dish was at first introduced in compliance to a depraved and debauched appetite, as well as to a crazy constitution, and to see a man hunting through an olio after the head and brains of a goose, a widgeon, or a woodcock, is a sign he wants a stomach and digestion for more substantial victuals. Further, they affirm that digressions in a book are like foreign troops in a state, which argue the nation to want a heart and hands of its own, and often either subdue the natives or drive them into the most unfruitful corners. But, after all that can be objected by these supercilious censors, it is manifest the society of writers would quickly be reduced to a very inconsiderable number of men, who put upon making books with the fatal confinement of delivering nothing beyond what is to the purpose. It is acknowledged that were the case the same among us as with the Greeks and Romans, when learning was in its cradle, to be reared and fed and clothed by invention, it would be an easy task to fill up volumes upon particular occasions, without further expatiating from the subject than by moderate excursions helping to advance or clear the main design. But with knowledge it has fared us with a numerous army encamped in a fruitful country, which for a few days maintains itself by the product of the soil it is on, till provisions being spent, they send to forage many a mile among friends or enemies, it matters not. Meanwhile the neighbouring fields, trampled and beaten down, become barren and dry, affording no sustenance but clouds of dust. The whole course of things being thus entirely changed between us and the ancients, and the moderns wisely sensible of it, we of this age have discovered a shorter and more prudent method to become scholars and wits without the fatigue of reading or of thinking. The most accomplished way of using books at present is twofold: either first to serve them as some men do lords, learn their titles exactly and then brag of their acquaintance, or secondly, which is indeed the choicer, the profounder and politer method, to get a thorough insight into the index by which the whole book is governed and turned, like fishes by the tail. For to enter the palace of learning at the great gate requires an expense of time and forms, therefore men of much haste and little ceremony are content to get in by the back door. For the arts are all in a flying march, and therefore more easily subdued by attacking them in the rear. Thus physicians discover the state of the whole body by consulting only what comes from behind. Thus men catch knowledge by throwing their wit on the posteriors of a book, as boys do sparrows with flinging salt upon their tails. Thus human life is best understood by the wise man's rule of regarding the end. Thus are the sciences found like Hercules' oxen by tracing them backwards. Thus are old sciences unravelled like old stockings by beginning at the foot. Besides all this, the army of the sciences hath been of late with a world of martial discipline drawn into its close order, so that a view or a muster may be taken of it with abundance of expedition. For this great blessing we are wholly indebted to systems and abstracts in which the modern fathers of learning, like prudent usurers, spent their sweat for the ease of us their children. For labour is the seed of our idleness, and it is the peculiar happiness of our noble age to gather the fruit. Now the method of growing wise, learned, and sublime having become so regular an affair, and so established in all its forms, the number of writers must needs have increased accordingly, and to a pitch that has made it of absolute necessity for them to interfere continually with each other. Besides, it is reckoned that there is not at this present a sufficient quantity of new matter left in nature to furnish and adorn any one particular subject to the extent of a volume. This I am told by a very skilful computer, who hath given a full demonstration of it from rules of arithmetic. This perhaps may be objected against by those who maintain the infinity of matter, and therefore will not allow that any species of it can be exhausted. For answer to which, let us examine the noblest branch of modern wit or invention, planted and cultivated by the present age, and which of all others hath borne the most and the fairest fruit. For though some remnants of it were left us by the ancients, yet have not any of those, as I remember, been translated or compiled into systems for modern use. Therefore we may affirm to our own honour that it has in some sort been both invented and brought to a perfection by the same hands. What I mean is that highly celebrated talent among the modern wits of deducing similitudes, allusions, and applications, very surprising, agreeable, and apposite from the signs of either sex, together with their proper uses. And truly, having observed how little invention bears any vogue besides what is derived in these channels, I have sometimes had a thought that the happy genius of our age and country was prophetically held forth by the ancient typical description of the Indian pygmies, whose stature did not exceed above 2 feet, sed quorum pudenda crassa et ad talos usque potingentia. Now I have been very curious to inspect the late productions, wherein the beauties of this kind have most prominently appeared. And although this vein hath bled so freely, and all endeavours have been used in the power of human breath to dilate, extend, and keep it open, like the Scythians, who had a custom and an instrument to blow up these parts of their mares, that they might yield the more milk, yet I am under an apprehension it is near growing dry, and past all recovery, and that either some new fond of wit should, if possible, be provided, or else that we must e'en be content with repetition here as well as upon all other occasions. This will stand as an uncontestable argument that our modern wits are not reckoned upon the infinity of matter for a constant supply. What remains therefore but that our last recourse must be had to large indexes and little compendiums. Quotations must be plentifully gathered and booked in alphabet. To this end, though authors need be little consulted, yet critics and commentators and lexicons carefully must, but above all, those judicious collectors of bright parts, and flowers, and observandas, are to be nicely dwelt on by some called the sieves and bolters of learning, though it is left undetermined whether they dealt in pearls or meal, and consequently whether we are more to value that which passed through, or what stayed behind. By these methods, in a few weeks there starts up many a writer, capable of managing the profoundest and most universal subjects. For what though his head be empty, provided his commonplace book be full, and if you will bait him, but the circumstances of method and style and grammar and invention allow him but the common privileges of transcribing from others and digressing from himself as often as he shall see occasion, he will desire no more ingredients towards fitting up a treatise that shall make a very comely figure on a bookseller's shelf, there to be preserved neat and clean for long eternity, adorned with the heraldry of its title fairly inscribed on a label, never to be thumbed or greased by students, nor bound to everlasting chains of darkness in a library, but when the fullness of time is come shall happily undergo the trial of purgatory in order to ascend the sky. Without these allowances, how is it possible we modern wits should ever have an opportunity to introduce our collections, listed under so many thousand heads of a different nature, for want of which the learned world would be deprived of infinite delight as well as instruction, and we ourselves buried beyond redress in an inglorious and undistinguished oblivion? From such elements as these, I am alive to behold the day wherein the corporation of authors can outvie all its brethren in the field, a happiness derived to us with a great many others from our Scythian ancestors, among whom the number of pens was so infinite that the Grecian eloquence had no other way of expressing it than by saying that in the regions far to the north it was hardly possible for a man to travel, the very air was so replete with feathers. The necessity of this digression will easily excuse the length, and I have chosen for it as proper a place as I could readily find. If the judicious reader find a fitter, I do here empower him to remove it into any other corner he please, and so I return with great alacrity to pursue a more important concern. End of section 7.